Megan, are we all set?
Are we missing Anne?
Not yet. No, she's here, but not yet. Go ahead, Emily.
Megan, are we all set?
Yep.
All right, well, good evening, everybody. Today is Wednesday, May 13th, 2020. The time is 6:31. I'm going to call this budget meeting to order at this time and welcome members of the public who may be joining us, and certainly fellow council colleagues and city staff. I'd like to turn it over to our city clerk just to give some information about how members of the public can participate in this meeting, and then we will begin following the rest of our agenda. So Megan, thank you.
Sure. Hi, everyone. So a couple rules. I ask that you keep your video off and keep yourself muted during the meeting so that we can hear the council members and staff. If you would like to participate and you have a comment, you can either email public comment at burlingame.org. You can chat, which is a feature on Zoom, and you'll just be chatting with me, or you can raise your hand and that'll alert Mayor Beach that you have a comment. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Madam City Clerk. And if you are joining by phone and you're a member of the public, the way you can raise your hand is dial *9 and we'll know that you have a comment at that time. So I'd like to ask everybody to join me in the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, and then we will have roll call. So stand. Ready? Begin. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. All right, thank you. Madam City Clerk, if you could do roll call for us, please.
Councilmember Coulson.
Here.
Councilmember Brownrigg.
Present.
Councilmember Ortiz.
Present as well.
Vice Mayor O'Brien Keegren.
Here.
Mayor Beach.
I am here as well. Thank you. At this point, we will take public comments that are for any item that is not currently on our agenda. And again, for members of the public who are joining us tonight, this meeting is focused on our budget. And there's really three components to the meeting. The first is to discuss any changes and formal amendments that we need to make via resolution to our current fiscal year, which starts July 1st, 2019 and ends June 30th, 2020. The second item on our agenda is a study session on the fiscal year 2020 through 2021 budget outlook, starting July 1st. And then the third item is we will review a draft of our capital improvement program. So there's three components to the meeting tonight. Members of the public have something they wish to say to the council that is not related to any of these three items. This is the opportunity to do it. If the Ralph M. Brown Act, which is a state and local agency open meeting law, prohibits the city council from acting or deliberating on any matter that is not on the agenda, but we certainly always welcome your comments, and you could have 3 minutes to tell us anything that's on your mind. So with that, I'll ask the city clerk, do we have any members of the public who wish to speak on an item that's not on the agenda?
There are no comments.
Okay, sounds good. And I'm scrolling. I don't see any other hands raised. With that, we will close public comment and we'll move on to our staff reports, which is discussing the current fiscal year 1920 operating and capital budgets to reflect revised projections for the remainder of the fiscal year, which we are all certainly aware that COVID-19 is playing a significant role in our current budget and ongoing projections for the next fiscal year. So with that, we'll go ahead and we will turn it over to our Finance Director, Ms. Carol Augustine.
Hi, thank you. I do not have a slide presentation on this staff report. It's basically a do-over of the mid-year report that we brought to the council in early March. In early March, we could see that the mid-year report was sort of dead on arrival because everything was changing at that point. So we had rosy projections for the rest of the fiscal year that we just basically had to unravel and reverse our stance. The coronavirus pandemic has created unprecedented disruption to the markets, to the global supply chains, to to just about every aspect of the economy. And it's reflected in rising unemployment, a national shelter-in-place strategy, and a decline in GDP. And I talk a little bit about that in the staff report because it was so very different than what we presented at the mid-year. The combined effect of all of this was a drop in personal income and therefore a decline in TOT and sales taxes. Particularly for Burlingame, we are very susceptible to these changes in the economy. So we're also utilizing this opportunity to get the funding, both from the bonds and the capital investment reserve funding for the community center on the books. So we are recommending adoption of the resolution to amend the current year budgets for all of those items, mostly revenue items, plus the community center. Are there any questions?
Mayor Beach, you are muted and you're talking.
Thank you. Thank you. Sorry about that. We appreciate the overview. There is a 27-page staff report that we've all reviewed with a lot of details and projections. Director Augustine gave us that brief overview. At this point, it sounds like there's no further slide presentation. So I'd like to invite colleagues to ask questions. And I see Councilmember Coulson has her hand raised.
Thank you. So thank you, Carol. Appreciate the update here. And I'm just curious, if we adopt this year-end budget with the 6,500 or 6.5 million that's going into the essentially the capital reserve account, and then we go on to look at next year's budget and the other ensuing year's budgets, and we decide that we need more, we want to allocate, say, half of that or some of that money into next year's budget to cover some holes or some potential holes. Can we do that, or is that a one-way street? Once we put the money in the reserve, is it in the capital reserve? Is that it?
No, the reserve is an assignment of the capital fund balance, and so the council can determine how to use it. The policy says that council can determine how to use the capital investment reserve. It's intended for capital projects that are sort of outside the scope of our regular operating budget, but with a council decision to withdraw some funds from that for emergency or for operational purposes. Yes, if they decide to do that, that can be done. It's all an internal designation.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Director Augustine, just clarify again, what is the exact number on the capital that's proposed? Can you give us that exact number again? That's 6.5 million. 6.5. Okay, thank you. I see Vice Mayor O'Brien has a question. Go ahead.
Yes, actually, my question was quite similar because just in looking at some of these figures for especially the TOT, I would even go a little more conservative. So I just wanted to make sure that, if we have this in the capital improvement, we can take it out and put it in general fund if need be for operations.
And yes, indeed, that is possible. The funds have already been transferred, but if you wish to change any given budget, it would just take a decision to do so and a resolution. So I would probably recommend that wait for mid-year next 2021.
2021. Okay, thank you.
Other questions? If not, I'll share one. I would just like some insight, Director Augustine, for our sales tax projections. I know we've got a consulting firm that gives us some insight, but I know even just I think of our most recent Transportation Authority meeting, which oversees Measure A sales tax for infrastructure projects for the whole county. It's just, we haven't had our budget meeting yet, but it's hard to know what the impact will be. So when we look at the sales tax projections, is it really Can you help us understand how you derive those numbers? Is it sort of a best guess at this point? Is there any communication with the state? Has the state put out some sales tax? Has the county put out additional sales tax information, even for some of the money that could be coming in for our infrastructure? Or is it really just everybody's best guess right now?
Well, it's everybody's best educated guess. As you mentioned, HDL is our sales tax consultant, and these figures were drawn up based on their April revised projections for all of the state of California for the current fiscal year and next fiscal year. The HDL projected decreases by sector, by sales tax sector. And so we applied those same increases or decreases to our particular mix here in Burlingame to get revenues for this year and next year. And we just had a meeting with them this afternoon that went over fourth quarter results from last year and from 2019. And it's the most recent sales tax data we have. So, our budget projections were very, very close to what they projected for the city of Burlingame, because they also went through that calculation. So it was gratifying to know that we were not too far off. They also projected for 21-22, and our projection is a little bit rosier than theirs is for 21-22. But for what we have in front of us tonight, I'm glad that we came in on target as far as our budget projections are concerned.
Okay, thank you. And then sort of a follow-up, as far as property tax, we see that that's at least more stable because that is what it is. But is there any reason to believe that I know the county sort of extended some property tax deadlines. The governor is talking about, penalties being waived. Is there any concern that you have that our city won't receive the property tax we anticipate, or is that just handled separately? Is that anything?
It is a totally different process,
okay.
But the county does distribute property taxes based on what is assessed. And under the teeter program, we receive all the property taxes that are due us. And the county goes after delinquencies and gets any penalties or interest associated with late payments.
Okay. Thank you for that. I see two other colleagues now have their hands up. Councilmember Bradring, I think you were first, and then we'll go to Councilmember Ortiz.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I just want to be clear what we're talking about at this point in the agenda. I thought we were talking about the adjustments we're making to FY20,
Yes.
But if we're also talking about FY21 and 22, I do have comments about that. But we're just focused on FY20, right?
Yes. Yep.
Okay.
Right now. Yep. Exactly.
Okay. So that's fine. I want to circle back to both the sales tax and the hotel tax forecast for the full years in the future. I would find it slightly helpful if, when we talk about quarters, if we could just describe whether we mean calendar Q4 or fiscal year Q4. But that's a small point. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you, Councilmember Brownrigg, and Councilmember Ortiz.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just wanted to kind of make the same point. We're talking about the fiscal year that is almost over. And so these numbers are mostly baked in, except for the changes that we're dealing with right now. So again, some of this stuff is already baked in. We don't have to do many changes.
That is correct. On sales tax, though, the reporting is so far behind. We get actual figures 4 months after the actual transactions, up to 4 months after the actual transactions occur. And so that's why it is sort of still a guessing game. We know that we did really well on our taxes collected through December 31st, the fourth quarter of calendar year 2019. But we have no idea of what is happening currently, what happened in the first quarter of 2020, or what is happening currently. And because the governor allowed a deferral of the payment and the filing of sales taxes, we won't know for quite some time. We will be having to make some educated estimates when we close the books on 1920 as to exactly how much sales tax revenue we have for the year.
Thank you for that. I see Vice Mayor O'Brien has another question. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think my question though might be the next budget cycle. Because there is a statement in this report that makes the assumption that the virus would be kind of ending its course in September. And that's not what I'm hearing. I'm hearing there's going to be a second wave of this in the fall. So I'm not sure how that kind of runs into these numbers.
Correct. We and that would that deals mainly with the uncertainties we have for the upcoming fiscal year, starting July 1st. So if there is a second wave, and our projections do not include that assumption. So that is a perfectly valid assumption. We're talking, when we say it's run its course, we're saying the economic damage is done and we start recovery in September. So that was probably not worded all that well.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. Seeing no additional questions regarding the big picture for the 1920 budget. Actually, just for the purposes of for the benefit of the public, Director Augustine, that maybe haven't read the staff report. I mean, I think there's a bottom line as far as our our revenue projections have changed, right? Our budget has changed this year. Could you just summarize the highest level for the benefit of the public before we open up to public comment?
Yes, we are asking for a budget amendments to our revenues, general fund revenues. They will be taken down $9.9 million. We are asking for some revenue decreases in other funds as well. The most significant one being a $1.7 million drop in sewer service charges. And then the other large amendment is to fund the community center project. Yep.
Okay, thank you so much for that. And we certainly have talked a lot about the community center and that project and in prior meetings this spring. Okay, with that, seeing no other questions from colleagues, we'll go ahead and we'll open this up to public comment. And again, the item we're discussing right now is fiscal year 1920, which ends on June 30th. So a lot of this information has been discussed more thoroughly in March, and these are amendments. Do we have any members of the public who would like to speak on this item?
No, we have no comment.
Okay, no comments here, and I'm glancing to see if any hands are raised on Zoom. I don't see anything. So with that, we will close public comment. And our task now is, if there's any further deliberation, we can do that, but we do have to adopt this resolution, which approves adjustments to the estimated revenues and appropriations for fiscal year 1920 budget. Anybody have any further deliberations or would like to make a motion? I see Councilmember Coulson has her hand up. Councilmember Coulson, I'm sorry, I think you may be on mute still.
Sorry about that.
No
Carol, I'm happy to make a motion to approve the budget, but before I do that, I had one quick question that I forgot to ask, which was, so when AB 5 passed, I know there was some changes to our budgeting that had to occur. Is that really going to be reflected in this budget or the next budget?
There was very little impact to this year's budget, but next year's budget, definitely.
Okay, that was just my only question. So I'm happy to make a motion to approve the current budget as proposed by Carol, the staff.
Second.
I'll second that.
Okay, I hear a motion made by Councilmember Coulson and a second by Councilmember Ortiz. We'll do our roll call vote.
Councilmember Coulson,
Yes.
Councilmember Brownray,
Yes.
Councilmember Ortiz,
Yes.
Vice Mayor O'Brien,
Yes.
Mayor Beach.
Yes. Motion passes unanimously, and thanks to staff for their hard work on adjusting to such a great degree, on the fly responding to COVID-19. Not great news, but that is the way of things right now. So we are moving on now to the next item on our agenda, which is a study session at this point on fiscal year 2020 through 21 budget, which begins July 1st. And so at this point, we'll have a staff report from Director Augustine again.
Okay, we do have a PowerPoint presentation for this staff report. So
1 second, I'm loading it for
no
you.
worries. All right, thank you. So yes, this is the new budget. Because this is a study session, I think more so than in recent years, the council will want to discuss this at more length. So don't be frightened by the number of slides that are here. I will go through them pretty quickly. On the first slide, we talk about the economic about face that was clearly illustrated in the 2019-20 budget amendment that was just passed. It's a dramatic shift since the March mid-year report presentation. In past years, we usually roll forward the revenues from the mid-year report and the 5-year forecast, and that allows us to really focus on the expenditures. Usually we just have to explain any changes in the revenues from what we had forecast a mere 2 months ago. But this year, of course, it's a lot different. We had to re-examine each revenue line item and try to figure out what might most reasonably be the COVID-19 impact on each revenue source for both the current fiscal year and the budget year. So as a result, we had to take steps to prevent depletion of the city's reserves, and those steps that we are taking are pretty textbook municipal finance for a downturn. We utilized your rainy day funds when it rains, and it's raining. We reduce our capital projects to the extent possible and use other funds to the extent available and appropriate. So we did have to focus on the short term to a greater extent in this budget. We'll try not to be too myopic about it, but what happens in the next 6 to 12 months will determine whether we can weather this storm well or need to brace for a longer economic downturn. So clearly the city's rainy day funds are limited. We can't assume that we can continue to draw heavily on reserves in future years. So the challenges for the general fund is to top priority during the downturn is to be able to provide day-to-day operations and the necessary capital needs required to sustain high quality services. We'll try and stay to the plan of funding long-term legally obligated liabilities. And to the extent possible, we want to provide for infrastructure needs and try to advance planning on the city's longer term priority initiatives, policies and strategies, or at least do no harm as far as the work that has already been done on these longer term issues. So on the next slide, it has, in a nutshell, the various ways that we are addressing the challenge. Because we assumed that the general fund revenues would continue to be weak for at least the first half of the next fiscal year. Compared to last year, the general fund transfer out to fund capital projects was reduced. The CIP transfer out is now reduced to 3.1 million as opposed to last year it was 9.1 million. We eliminated the transfer to capital investment reserve, and this is because it's in previous years the base amount of 3 million was shown in the budgets. As was mentioned earlier, the actual transfer in the current fiscal year was 6.5 million, but we will not be contributing to the capital investment reserve from the general fund this year because it's just not a time to be saving. It's a time to be utilizing those reserves. This budget does utilize $2 million in funds that had been set aside in fiscal year 18-19 for debt service of the 2019 lease revenue bonds, the community center bonds, but it remains in the debt service funds unused because the bonds weren't issued until the current fiscal year. So we're going to utilize that $2 million this year and not make an additional $2 million transfer out of the general fund for debt service. But we do continue to fund the city's 115 pension trust fund, which, as I show here, was 2.25 million from the general fund and almost 2.8 million citywide. General fund revenues were down 13.9% from the 2019-20 adopted budget. That's 4.4% lower than the adjusted budget as it was just adjusted. Total general fund operating expenditures are up 6.1% from 2019-20, the current year adopted budget, 2.3% higher than adjusted budget. And then the total general fund balance is anticipated to decrease 1.13 million. Again, we do still make the contribution to the Section 115 pension trust fund. So the change to the general fund unassigned fund balance was actually higher, but we'll see that in a few slides. Speaking of general fund revenues, on page 4 of the staff report, you see revenues of the current fiscal year as adjusted just now, and see that some of our major revenues are going to be slower coming up than they went down, and will not perform as well for us in fiscal year 2021. So we'll take a look at our big three, starting with transient occupancy taxes, TOT, hotel taxes on the next slide. As one might imagine, TOT is very much tied to the economy, the travel industry in particular. So this chart shows Burlingame's TOT revenues based on the hotel's filings through March compared with the same month last year. Now, as I noted, I think previously, that the city allowed hotels within its jurisdiction to defer remittance of these taxes collected from March through June. We are not requiring that they be remitted until July 31st. But the filing of the returns is still required. So that's why we do have data all the way through March, even though we don't have all of the remittances yet. TOT returns are usually due at the end of the subsequent month. So we just got the March data at the end of April. And at this time, payment of about $770,000 of the TOT collected has been deferred. So many of the hotels did take us up on that option to defer remittance of those taxes. And that's the only slide I have on transient occupancy taxes. For property taxes, we don't see that they'll significantly change from the mid-year forecast. Secured property taxes are expected to grow at a similar rate to what has occurred in the current fiscal year, which is 6.5%. And although currently we are experiencing a slowdown in property sales, we don't anticipate that the slowdown in turnover will continue. Also considered a property tax, the ERAF, the Educational Revenue Augmentation Fund held by the county. We are assuming that we received 2.38 million in ERAF refunds this year, and we project that that will stay at that level. There's a lot of factors involved in the ERAF calculations. So as you know, we made a significant downward adjustment in property tax in lieu of VLF. It was called the VLF shortfall. It was supposed to be funded by the local ERAF. As it turns out, the shortfall was not as high as we initially had estimated, but it does go to show that this funding source is very variable, and it's within the property tax category. These two, the VLF and the ERAF refunds, are never for certain, but nonetheless, we assume for the 2021 budget that excess ERAF distribution will be approximately the same.
Carol, I believe the Vice Mayor has a question for you.
Yes.
And Vice Mayor, you're on mute right now, so.
Back to the TOT.
Yes.
Do you want questions at the end or throughout the presentation?
It doesn't matter if you have a question on TOT that we can.
Yeah, I do. So in the staff report, I think it says here, you think that the hotels will recover to about 70% by December. How do you
Yes.
come to that conclusion?
That was from a conversation we had with the hotels in March. So that John Hutar, I believe, stated that they felt that even come the end of this calendar year, they would not be back up to 70% of last year. That's not occupancy rate. That is as of from last year.
Okay, it to me, it seems pretty optimistic. I would think it'd be much less.
Well, the phone call was not really optimistic, but that is basically what they were anticipating at the time. Now that, was
Okay.
it in March or was it in early April? I can't.
Wasn't it our April Economic Development
Yes, it
meeting?
was April.
Yeah, I remember that being mentioned, but I think, from what I hear from the health officer, that, especially when, we get the occupancy because of airlines, one, and conferences. And at least from the governor and some of the health officers, they don't foresee any type of big gatherings, possibly the rest of the year. So that's why I think the 70% is high.
Correct. Well, what you say is correct. Mr. Hutar said that the reason for the long delay in recovering is because of, just as you stated, so much of their business travel comes from the East, from New York, and until the East Coast opens up, we won't see the kind of business travel we have in the past. However, the other types of travel will continue. People still need to go see family, and I guess they figure, I'm not quite sure. I guess we could ask him before this is finalized if those projections have changed.
Yeah, I think that might be a good idea, because I think how we saw this in March may be different than how we see it in another few weeks.
I'm gonna sit on a webinar that he invited us to. I think it's next Thursday, so I may have some additional information. The thing about our budget is it's not static. And so even if we adopt a budget in June that has these exact same projections, we can revisit as we go forward. The South City manager talked about revisiting their budget in October because there's so much we just don't know yet. And so, you know, we'll do our best to get the best information that we have, but we have a requirement to get a budget adopted in June. So at some point we have to call it, adopt the budget, and then come back with amendments as we need to.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I think we definitely should be reassessing this at a later date when things possibly change.
I think I saw Councilmember Ortiz with a hand up, although now it's not up anymore. So I'm not sure if I talked over you. Sorry.
No, you didn't. But Madam Mayor, if I could, I have to agree with Vice Mayor O'Brien. I think that what we were looking at back in March is a little different now. And so, but I'm okay with waiting and reassessing this at a later date. But I do think that this is a little optimistic.
No, we did not utilize that 70% figure for the entire fiscal year. I believe they actually had projections by month. So it's a slow crawl up to that 70% in December. So it's likely that just because even if we are 70% recovered by December, for the fiscal year, we could be, 50% of what we were last year.
Thank you, Director Augustine. I just, if we're through with TOT, I did have a question while we're paused on ERAF and the VLF shortfall. In kind of big picture, my understanding is this is always something we don't anticipate a lot of, but it's because it is an element of discretionary and it's what's available at the time, but we're keeping it consistent. Can you help me understand, do you think we should be anticipating less coming in next year? Or my understanding is we're keeping it stable?
We are keeping it stable. The complications are in the calculation and what is funded first from the ERAF and what can be then distributed back to the agencies that contributed it to the fund. It's complex, but it would be disingenuous to say that it is going to go down or up on anything other than the property taxes. Property taxes will go up, we believe, and therefore the property taxes that the schools receive should go up. And unless there is a vast change in the amount, the number of schools that are basic aid as opposed to non-basic aid, that all has to do with the calculations and to what extent the state has to step up and fund the schools through those ERAF funds. So it's a delicate dance.
Okay, thank you. I see Councilmember Coulson has a question.
I'm sorry, because we're jumping around here, Carol, but I just, back on the TOT really quick for a second. I want to make sure I understand a number. So they said the TOT will be 70%. So we're not talking occupancy at 70%. What we're basically saying is 70% of the TOT from last December would come this December. What? I'm confused.
Yes. They're basing it on the month of the previous year.
Okay, so then if we were at around like 86% occupancy to 89% in last December, which I think is where we were, and then we're talking 70% of that revenue. When I back those numbers in, that comes out to more like a 60% occupancy rate is what they're expecting. Does that sound right?
Well, they didn't phrase it like that. They phrased it as revenues. So, another thing that might happen is that room rates go down.
Yeah, room rate could be lower. And okay. Yeah, there's two moving pieces in there, room rate and occupancy rate. Okay.
Right.
But I just wanted to make, I guess the more important point is to make clear that I wanted to make sure I understood that the 70% was not an occupancy rate. It's the rate at which they think they'll recover on the actual TOT.
That's correct.
Okay, thank you. Sorry.
Thank you for that.
Yep, good clarifying question. All right, with that, unless colleagues have any question on either ERAF, VLF, or TOT, maybe we should go ahead and have Director Augustine continue.
Okay, should we talk about sales taxes? Taxable sales for the first half of 2019-20 were down 5.2% compared to fiscal year 2018-19. And I should say only 5.2% because, as you recall, 18-19 had so many anomalies, we were actually anticipating a 17% decrease from the prior fiscal year. We weren't anticipating a downturn, we were just anticipating that we wouldn't have those same one-time anomalies experienced in the current fiscal year. So we were really surprised by the strength of the numbers from July through December. Which is why we proposed a $2.1 million increase at mid-year. After COVID-19, we had to decrease that estimate to by $2.6 million. So anyway, the Wayfair decision, AB 147, that requires out-of-state retailers to collect the tax on their online sales, did help the fourth quarter revenue somewhat, boosting the San Mateo County pool by 5.7%. Our projection was calculated with the help of HDL, our sales tax consultant, who, as I said, provided estimates of sales tax reductions by sector for both the current fiscal year and next. And so we are not real certain about those, but we're as certain as we can be. And then this slide talks about two programs that were announced by Governor Newsom in the last day of March to temporarily defer sales tax liabilities for small businesses in California. The first executive order allows a 90-day extension for returns and payments of first quarter 2020 sales taxes. And the majority of Burlingame sales tax contributors do qualify as small businesses. Nearly 92% of our filers and 54% of the total sales tax dollars are subject to this or allowed to take this 90-day extension. In addition, the CDTFA, the California Department of Tax and Fee Administration, will allow small businesses to enter into a 12-month interest-free installment plan for up to $50,000 of sales and use tax liability. So this deferral is available to 80% of Burlingame filers and impact about 17% of our total sales tax dollars. Both the programs were meant to offer a bit of a reprieve, cash flow wise, to allow businesses to remain afloat during the crisis if they choose to utilize it. But not only will these programs significantly impact our budget, but it also means we are unlikely to be able to obtain reliable sales tax data from the state until mid-year 2021. But since that's the time we'll be making adjustments anyway, I guess that we'll have to do. This graph is the all the way through the fourth quarter of 2019, the last actual data we have regarding sales tax receipts. And as I said, it's probably the last good data we will have for a while to see what's really going on out there. So the next slide shows that for fiscal year 2021, the revenue pie, it might look familiar, except that last year, compared to last year's adopted budget, the TOT provided the largest share. TOT provided 36.5% of last year's adopted budget, or the current year's adopted budget. Property tax was 29.4%. Sales tax was, I'm sorry, property tax was 30, yeah, that's right, 29.4, and sales tax was 36.5. So you can see that there's been a little bit of shifting around. It still equates to about 85% of our general fund revenues. It's just the pieces of the pie are portioned a little bit differently. So we can talk about expenditures now. In the staff report, the general fund expenditure discussion starts on page 14. And try as we may to contain costs, the general fund expenditures for next year's budget are up compared to the current year budget. Much of the increase was in personnel expenditures, up 3.2% overall, due to the added FTEs from the current fiscal year and some benefit cost increases. Other operating cost increases were up as well, 3.8% if adjusted for current year expenditures for the COVID assistance costs. The next slide shows all general fund appropriations by program. This is on page 15 of the staff report. There's also a table of expenditures broken down by functional level, slightly more detail on page 16. And then on the next slide is our appropriations by type. Here's where you can see that that 1.1 million of the 1.4 million increase is in personnel costs.
One moment, Director Augustine. Vice Mayor, did you have your hand up? Or no?
No.
Okay, sorry. Thank you.
No worries. The next slide shows benefits, salaries, wages, and benefits in a little bit more detail. So you can see where the 3.2% of personnel costs increases come in. The largest portions monetarily are retirement and health premiums. For health premiums, we don't really have a good grasp on where those are going. The only information we got about those is that health premiums, which are modified every year on January 1st of each calendar year, could go up anywhere between 10 and 40%. So that wasn't very helpful, but we do include a 20% premium increase on January 1st. So that applied to our current personnel database to come up with that cost. And retirement costs are up. The amount shown here is just the employer's required contribution rates, and also includes the additional employees that we have this year. On the next slide are authorized full-time equivalents. On the left is a table of authorized FTE, but it's just for the general fund. In the staff report, page 20, you see it's for all funds. There are an additional 2 FTE in the building fund. There are no changes in FTE for fiscal year 2021, but the number of staff positions was increased in the current fiscal year. So we wanted you to see that instead of a column of all zeros, because although these changes, these additions did not impact the current fiscal year terribly, most of them were done after mid-year. They will impact the 2021 budget. The staff report also identifies several classification changes in fiscal year 2021 budget that will need to be approved by the council also in June. The fiscal impact of those changes, though, is negligible. So in general, when we put it all together for the general fund summary on the next slide, this is where we see the total change, a decrease in fund balance of 1.1 million. Revenues of 66.1 million, departmental expenditures of 63.9 million, transfer of debt service of 2.7 million, 3.1 million in transfers out to fund capital projects, offset by transfers in from other funds of nearly 2.6 million. And on the next slide, you see that 1.1 million deficit impacts the fund balance. And on the next slide, you see how that fund balance changes the city's reserves.
Carol, Councilmember Brownrigg has a question for you.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Yes, thank you, Director Augustine. Can you go back a slide? I'm sorry, one more. Yeah. So, you know, I want to mostly let you get through this presentation, and I look forward to the conversation that we'll have. But this is a pretty good visual for my concerns overall about our FY21 budget. So in FY19, which of course was last year and a good year, we achieved 84.5 million in revenue. In FY20, as adjusted, we achieved we are forecasting 69 million. But FY20 really only has one horrible quarter in it. You basically have 2 quarters that are excellent, 1 quarter that's pretty good, and then an abysmal quarter. And then if you look at FY21, you have almost the same number. So you basically are assuming overall, maybe not 1 horrible quarter and 3 good ones, but averaging to that. And I am significantly concerned that for us to assume we're going to achieve that kind of number is overly optimistic. And I just wanted to pause here because I think this is a good visual for that. And I'll let you keep going. It's not really a question. It's more just by way of commentary.
Yeah, no worries. I think that, you know, the adopted budget for 1920 showed that our sales taxes were going to go down by 2 million. We weren't forecasting any economic downturn. Yeah, 1819 actuals are quite high as far as revenue is concerned. It also includes some one-time factors other than sales taxes, like our investment earnings. At June 30th of last year, we recorded $1.7 million in unrealized gains. So that makes the investment earnings look high as well. So there's a lot of nuance behind each of those revenues. And yeah, we tried not to be too overly optimistic, but you're right. This is something that the council can discuss, and we can.
Thank you. I'll let you continue, and rather than engage in a back and forth right this minute, but thank you.
Okay, and this shows our ending fund balance down $1.1 million. I've inserted this slide here on capital improvement program to show the transfers out for capital projects. So you can see that's where a lot of the shaving back took place for this upcoming fiscal year. And then we can move on to the 5-year forecast. We do have 3 scenarios. A lot of people refer to them as the recovery will be either V-shaped, U-shaped, or L-shaped. That's not really very descriptive of ours. All our scenarios begin with the current projected general fund budget, and the focus is on revenue recovery. When we talk about 100% revenue recovery, we look at 2018-19 actuals, which was, again, a very good year for revenues. Scenario A stresses gradual return to a new normal. Then adjusting to that new normal, deficits continue through 21-22. So it is U-shaped. It's a very broad U-shape because nothing is going to snap back, and some of our revenues are not going to get back to 18-19 levels for several years. But as a whole, The deficits continue through 21-22, and then 23-24. We have some surplus, not enough to fund a $3 million transfer to the capital investment reserve, but definitely a recovery. Scenario B suggests a snap back to normal, emphasizes pent up demand, and suggests a return to surpluses by 21-22. It's the closest thing that we have to a V-shaped recovery, although the downturn was much swifter over a couple of months than the recovery will be. So we are not using that as our most probable scenario. Scenario C takes a more pessimistic approach. Nothing will come back anytime soon. Revenue recovery under this scenario takes 8 years. The city would need to take steps that are not assumed here. And I think I pretty well went over that in the staff report. We do not assume a cutback on operating expenditures, which of course would take place under scenario C. We do not assume further reduction in our capital improvement program, a drawdown on our pension trust fund before the threshold level is met. We do not assume use of the capital investment reserve for operations or maintenance capital projects. Etc. So this is scenario C is not a worst case scenario. I mean, it's just the more pessimistic one. For example, if we had other natural disasters or total collapse of the economy, that's not considered in this scenario. Even scenario C suggests that recovery is possible. It just, under that scenario, it takes 8 years. And so on the next slide, oh no, this is it. All our scenarios include the same projections for salaries and benefits, the same transfers to the 115 pension trust fund, some increase in property taxes, and the same transfers to capital projects according to the city's 5-year capital improvement plan. As is typical, all of our 5-year forecasts exclude any one-time revenues, even if from pending developments. We don't put them in the 5-year forecast until they break ground, and so we are certain that they are going to happen. We also exclude, again, draws from the 115 pension trust. So in other words, the council will have to decide on what actions would greatly alter both revenues and expenditures if, depending on how long it looks like the economy will take to recover. And I do believe the next 3 to 6 months is going to help us a lot in determining that.
Excuse me, Director Augustine, Councilmember Colson, did you have your hand up or?
No, is it up accidentally?
You know, it was another indicator on there, but I just wanted to, I didn't know if you.
Oh, you know what it could be? It's that
Yeah.
I just turned down. I X'd out all my, I couldn't see the slides, so I had to X all your faces out. Sorry.
Thank you. Okay, sorry. I just wanted to make sure if you had a question.
thank
we
you.
stopped,
Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Director Augustine. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think I'm pretty much done with this slide. So attached to the staff report are the 3 different scenarios that we can talk more about. This slide is just to show that we do have 24.6 million in our capital investment reserve after funding the new community center project. This is not part of the 5-year forecast, but it is clear that when we get particularly to the 5-year forecast CIP, that these funds will be needed for the Broadway grade separation project. To what extent, we do not know, but it will be in the next few years. And also included in the 5-year CIP is the knowledge that we have to fund the El Camino Real underground project, which is approximately 24 million. And it also will not be a lump sum sort of funding. It will take place over several years, but that should also, we'll need to have some funds available for that project in the near future. And then the next slide shows that we assume no draws on the city's pension trust fund balance in the 5-year scenarios. We do assume that we continue to contribute to the pension trust fund. The trust fund balance at March 31st was $11.2 million. So unfortunately, the pension trust fund is invested in instruments that can lose value. So market value of the fund at March 31st was 11.2 million, which is barely covers our contributions, but it does cover our contributions to date. And then also one slide to show the preliminary budget of all the city's funds. You can see that funding for capital projects is greatly decreased. Funding to most other activities are up compared to the prior year. The exception is the building fund. If you recall, we made a mid-year adjustment to increase that fund's appropriation for contractual services, $700,000 increase that was totally offset with an increase in revenue to the fund for the year. But all the other funds are showing, other than capital projects, upward appropriations for 2021. And then the last 2 slides, we don't have to go over very much, but I wanted to correct the tables that were included in the staff report. For the water fund, our last rate increase was January 1st, 2019. And for the sewer fund, the last increase was January 1st, 2012. You can see that a reduction in funding for capital projects is proposed for the sewer fund. It more than offsets the $1.7 million decrease in revenues that we just made for the 1920 budget, so that the sewer fund continues to meet its bond covenants. And we look forward to the sewer sanitary master plan being completed so we can make sure the rates are appropriately adjusted in order to maintain the fund's long-term sustainability. And so I think that's the last of my slides. I have a next steps slide, but I think the rest of this item is mostly for an exchange of ideas, council comments, direction, and then I'll talk about what we plan to provide at the June 15th public hearing. I can't hear that.
Mayor Beach, you're muted.
You know what I went ahead and thought I unmuted myself, but I muted myself instead. Eventually, I will get the hang of driving on this thing. Just kidding. Sorry about that. Thank you for the presentation and the commentary. This slide presentation, Director Augustine, is that something, or maybe this is City Clerk, that I'm sure it was kind of just in time. We have a great staff report, but this particular summary, can we get that added somehow to the online agenda, or circulated among all of us, soft copy as well?
We can't add it to the agenda since that already went out, but I can definitely send it to you all after this meeting. And we can post it somewhere on our website as well.
You can put it on the finance page. There's budget information there.
Yeah, that's what I'm driving at, just because it's a helpful summary that sort of highlights a lot of the details in the staff report. So thank you for it. Colleagues, at this point, do we have questions for staff? I know we kind of asked as we went along, and we definitely want to have opportunity to deliberate and public comment, but any particular questions at this point? Seeing none. Is there any, actually, what, this is sort of big, go ahead, Councilmember Coulson, you go ahead. And ask
Sure,
your
sure.
question.
Sorry about that. I was slow to the draw there. This is not necessarily something that we need to talk about tonight, but it's something that maybe, Carol, when we're talking about the 115 trust and we're looking at CalPERS and the returns and the contributions, I was reading up today just to see what's going on in that business. And our 115 trust is invested in a diversified portfolio that's similar to PERS, you know, with that kind of a return objective. But as the return objectives kind of come down, and as our timeline gets closer for us to need to draw down some of these funds, I'm almost wondering if we shouldn't look at maybe taking a portion out of those and putting them into more of a short-term investment fund so they're not subject to so much volatility around the market.
Yes, part of the portfolio is in shorter term obligations, which is probably protects it from going, you know, as the stock market goes.
I think that's great, because if we look at it and we think we're going to have sort of like an eight years out, we would start drawing on it to another decade or 15 years. I think it's like 2042. It kind of all draws down. If we look at that, that's a long-term investment horizon. So that makes sense for a really fully diversified portfolio. But if we think we might need to dip into that in the next year or two, I think exploring the possibility of how much cash we have and what the right number is probably appropriate in the fall.
Right. We'll have a detailed discussion in the fall,
Okay.
and we'll talk about different assumptions. But for now, the fund itself is really not as long-term as CalPERS.
Oh, that's good to know.
Because we will keep on contributing to the fund until we hit this threshold level. And then once we hit that threshold level, we will withdraw from the fund. So the total life of the fund should not be over 15 years.
Okay, great. And can you remind me, when do we start? What was the total amount we were shooting for? Like 15 or 18 million with a drawdown starting in like 3 or 4 years?
I believe that the estimated balance at the time that we would need to draw down was going to be 15 million.
Okay. Great. Thank you so very much.
Other questions, colleagues, before we open it up to public comment? If not, I had one. This is a little bit granular, but I think it's probably a little bit on our minds. Is there anything in the budget related to, I mean, obviously we're so much more dependent on IT functions and bandwidth and making sure we've got ability to work remotely. Are there any investments that this budget contemplates in our IT needs at this point, or is it sort of too soon to look at that? Is that possibly something we need to consider for a future budget? I don't know, maybe that's a question more for the city manager, or just throwing it out there as something that seems.
The internal service fund for IT admin is largely IT, and it is pretty much increased over the prior year. So departments are getting hit up with higher IT costs in 2021 and beyond. We did make a lot of additional purchases of laptops in the current fiscal year. And that is expected to continue. But we don't have any major system changes that haven't already been funded through the CIP.
Okay. All right. And maybe something even longer term as we get out of this, if there's any risk management we need to consider, or resources we need to, you know, optimize our productivity and some of the new normal that may be coming. You know, it's just something that seems top of mind. Thank you for that. Are there any other questions? If not, I'll go ahead and open up to public comment. We'll see if any members of the public would wish to comment on this current sort of draft budget for fiscal year 20/21. Madam City Clerk?
I haven't received any public comment.
Okay, I don't see any members of the public with hands up. And so at this moment, I will close public comment and we will go forth with sort of deliberations or impressions, big picture. And I do see Councilmember Brownrigg has his hand up.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. So, you know, I'll just pick up sort of where I started a few minutes ago. First of all, I really appreciate the work, Carol. I mean, it's terrific, thoughtful, and yes, we're all in an era of not knowing which way, how fast the rebound will come, how deep the recession may be, and so forth. So we have to acknowledge that, but we also have to plan making, you know, our best estimates. I think it was Yogi Berra who said the hard thing about predicting the future is it hasn't happened yet. So with that in mind, though, you know, when I look at what's happening to our economy, and I mean that both locally and nationally, it feels to me like a combination of both 9/11 and the Great Recession, because we have this massive hit to travel and hospitality. And then we have, I think, an inevitable massive hit to the economy. And I just find it very hard to believe that this economy, you know, somebody's going to say, okay, let's go back to work, and everyone troops back to work and goes back to restaurants and movie theaters. So, and my point in saying that is when you look backwards at those two downturns, the Great Recession and 9/11, in the case of 9/11, it took our hotel revenue 10 years to return to the amount it was before 9/11, 10 years. And if you look at the Great Recession, our sales tax took 6 years to recover to levels. And so I am concerned that our probable scenario is too optimistic. And I don't much care what the experts say because they don't know either. And I would advocate that this council should adopt a more conservative forecast for the next 2 to 3 years. What happens after that is so far out that it's hard and kind of useless to worry about. Well, you can worry about it, but there's not much percentage in guessing. But I would advocate that we adopt a more conservative FY21 revenue forecast. You know, I would take hotel revenues down to 14 million or 15 at most. I'd take sales tax down and keep it down, and then I would watch and see what happens to our reserves. The other thing that I would find helpful if we revisit these numbers, and I'm not sure, I think it makes sense to wait for the mid-year review or revision, although I could be talked into it because, as the city manager points out, you know, it is moving slowly enough. Actually, let me start with I should have started with a positive. This city entered this unexpected downturn with, I bet, one of the strongest balance sheets in the entire state. And I am proud of the work that we've done to put us in that position. This council should be proud of the financial reserves that we have and the strength that we have so that we can look our employees in the eye and look our residents in the eye and say, we're going to be able to keep offering great service for the next 2 to 3 years, no problem. Like I am certain that that is true because we went in with, depending on how you count it, 50 or 60% of general fund in reserve. To put that in perspective, I went back and looked at the state, and Governor Brown gets a lot of credit for creating rainy day funds, and his rainy day funds moved California, the state of California, from having 4% of its general fund in reserve to 8%. So, and they're ecstatic about having 8%, and we're sitting with nearly 60. So we're in a great position for this maelstrom. That said, I think we should lower our revenue forecasts and understand what then happens to reserves. And on that, what I found particularly helpful was the 5-year. It shows up on the forecast attachment, and it's under scenario A, the most probable, which looks out a number of years, but it's the fund balance, Carol, at the bottom. I find that to be a super handy kind of overview, and what it shows you, or at least what it showed me, is where we're taking the money from. So we're going to run a deficit, and it shows you your unassigned fund balance beginning to drop and dipping into the economic stability reserve. And if I were making a recommendation, it's that we not focus on the really granular stuff of different line items, and really look just at the big picture of how much revenue, what the same cost structure, which I think is right, but then see what happens to our reserves. I think it's going to be a good story. I think you can still make the pension payments, but to me, that's what I'd like to recommend. And I'm sorry, just since I have the microphone, I'll go back on mute. In that same sheet, the 5-year forecast, Carol, the forecast for the pension 115 trust, diminishes from 2.25 million to 1.9 to 1.3. I assume that I just want to make sure that those smaller payments are because that's when we're on our glide path to being fully funded for the 115 trust, right? Not because we think we can't afford it. I just want to be sure
Right.
that okay. So those
That is the same under all 3 scenarios.
Right,
Because the pension cost, the expense is the same, but we are getting closer to that threshold rate. So there's more in the expense column and less in this transfer to the pension.
right. So yeah, thank you for that. Because to me, the main question for us at the moment, since we're not going crazy on the spending side appropriately, is how we manage our reserves and how comfortable we are that our reserves can continue to support the level of expense in the next 2 to 3 years. I think the answer is it can, but that's, I guess, my comment, Madam Mayor, is I think we should run this on a more conservative revenue forecast.
Okay, thank you for that, Councilmember Brownrigg. I see Councilmember Ortiz has his hand up.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. And I have to echo most of what Councilmember Brownrigg said. For years, we've been talking about TOT and the volatility of TOT. And we always expected at some point it was going to come down. I don't think any of us predicted it would come down as dramatically, as quickly as it did. And so this is really kind of a very interesting situation. I keep thinking about what our conversation with the hoteliers earlier in the year in the 70%. And the thing I keep thinking about is that may be occupancy that will be down, but we also have to deal with the average room rates. So when you combine the occupancy drop with the drop in the room rates, I suspect that the hit's going to be a little bigger than what we have. So I have to agree with Councilmember Brownrigg that we should have a little more conservative estimate of revenues. And but having said that, I just, it really, the reserves that we built and how we've been talking about this is something you have to commend staff and holding back on expenditures and being able to put this aside. This is the rainy day and we have a big umbrella. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Councilmember Ortiz. Actually, I'd like to ask a follow-up question in response to the comments from Councilmember Brownrigg and Ortiz to staff. So I guess we have some choices here. Staff created a draft budget for this upcoming year. There's really no way to tell what the revenues are going to be. They could very well be even lower. So there's an element, well, I guess first of all, we could go with what's recommended or we could reduce it. If we reduce it, we don't really have anything scientific to go by. It might just be a percentage, but staff, when do you recommend we revisit this and relook at it? And since we don't have any scientific, data to say how much we should reduce it, is it better to leave as is and then just make sure when we have the next part of the conversation, which is capital improvements, that we go really fiscally conservative and don't spend as much, really on the lean side to prepare for the potential that those revenues are going to be a lot lower. What are your thoughts with how best to address the concern that the revenues really could be a lot worse than what this budget proposes? Or do you recommend wait and see and then revisit this more frequently?
Well, first of all, the capital projects that are to be funded in 2021 are very, very conservative. They have been greatly reduced from what we funded last year or in 1920 and what was suggested at the mid-year. So it has pretty much been already cut to respond to the decrease in revenues. Secondly, the change in the fund balance that's shown at the bottom of the forecast, particularly the change in economic stability reserve, is not so much a matter of we decided that that's where we're going to take it from. The economic stability reserve declines because our revenues, our projected revenues decline. And so that is based on 24% of the projected revenues. So really the bottom line is the unassigned fund balance. When we go below zero for our unassigned fund balance, we would then be not funding our economic stability reserve to the extent we desire and have in our policy. But, you know, necessity dictates that that would be the case. Yeah, we don't have any scientific way to predict. The best predictor that we have will be the present, and going forward, when we do figure out what 1920, how those figures come in, we'll be able to take another look at what our fund balances actually are at the end of 1920, and if we want to make adjustments to the budget really at any time, but we will present the 1920 financial statements late in the calendar year 2020, and it will be rapidly followed up by our mid-year report. So I would think that, I mean, typically that's the way we would do it if we come across, for example, a second wave of the virus and responsive controls on activity, then we could be called to adjust the budget earlier than normal. But we will be discussing pensions in the fall. I forgot to mention that all of these scenarios are built on the same pension assumptions, just so that we could keep everything else sort of stable other than revenues. And we anticipate a 0% rate of return for CalPERS in the current fiscal year. And that flows through to our rates in subsequent years. So, but we don't make any assumption other than a 7% return after that. So things will undoubtedly come out differently with pensions and with our other major expenses as well. But for revenues, you know, we just utilized every tool we had in our toolbox to estimate those. And you know, if you want to be more conservative, I mean, we can go back and rework the numbers and take some assumptions from scenario C, perhaps, and come up with a number more to your liking.
Okay, thank you, Director Augustine. I see Councilmember Coulson has her hand up for comments.
Thank you. So Carol, what I really like about this budget is that it shows, and I think almost all the scenarios show, that the good news is that we can maintain the level of city services that we have been providing in the past. And I owe a lot of gratitude, not just to the council, but to also our staff, Lisa and Carol, who have really, and all the department heads who have really, I think since I've been here for almost over 4 years, almost 5 years, I don't think we've wrestled very many new job positions out of you guys. And so just that thoughtfulness has been, I think, what's let us not only build up reserves. And I also want to thank, I think we also have to recognize our staff who have, contributed to their pensions, have, really worked with us to make sure that and understood why we were keeping reserves. And that's why we're not going to have to lay a bunch of people off and cut city services. But that said, I do think we have some past data that is somewhat scientific and can be extrapolated. When you look at the hoteliers, I don't think anyone anticipated that, Facebook would not really be bringing any people back into their offices till, I think I was talking to someone today about that, January of next year, maybe 20% work staff in the fall, and then they'll ramp up. I think a lot of companies that I'm talking to are on an extended stretch of when they're going to bring people back. Certainly there will be no big conferences. There's not going to be any big conventions. There's not going to be the overflow that would normally come from San Francisco, because those simply aren't going to be there. They're just not going to happen. And then, people aren't going to fly out to do business with someone who's working at home. They're just not. That's not how business works. You meet in an office. And so I think we have to look at that hotel TOT in two pieces. First of all, the airlines, and when those contracts are going to come back for airline flight attendants, because as I understand it, that can be up to 25 to 30% of some hotels TOT or their stays. And then, layering in on that, the demand side of it from the big corporate interests. And I just don't, when you have Airbnb and people like that laying off 2,000 employees, that's telling you that they don't think the travel industry is going to come back rapidly. So I would be comfortable actually reducing the TOT a little bit as well. And I don't think it really hits our bottom line. Michael, Councilman Brownrigg pulled out also my favorite page, scenario A. And even if that revenue is projected to be a little more conservative, and maybe the sales tax is a little more conservative, it's still going to be a budget that we don't have to make cuts and that we can make adjustments as we go forward. But I would rather under predict and then be surprised on the upside than I would have to keep coming back and downward revising the budget. So that's just kind of my own personal opinion with budgets, is they should be more conservative. And if we're surprised on the upside, great.
Thanks for the comment. And I see Vice Mayor O'Brien has her hand up.
I would actually agree with my colleagues. I would go with the most conservative approach. We have been lucky with past council members and staff in regards to really building up a reserve. So we're not in a position in relation to many other cities that will probably have to look at potential layoffs futuristically. So I, give an A+ to our staff on that. My biggest issue is the TOT. I think it's going to be worse than what's projected here in our staff report. Councilmember Coulson mentioned about, Facebook. And that was mentioned, I think, in one of our county updates, that the people at Facebook and also LinkedIn don't plan on going back to work until January. They'll be working from home. In regards to conferences in San Francisco, that was already declining before COVID-19. So that to me is going to continually decline. I think people are going to be very hesitant to go into kind of the big mass groups And from at least what's, been said from Governor Newsom, I don't predict that these conferences would be reconvening anytime soon. So the TOT, I would be the most conservative with. And then also, we do have to look at the sales tax and being a little more conservative with that also, because again, we're back to mass amount of people. And if you're keeping that 6-foot distance, we know our restaurants have to change how they do their business. And they're not going to probably fit half as many people as they used to. So we're going to see a continued decline. How long that lasts, we don't know. With more testing, I think we'll have a better idea. And then the other thing is we don't know when a vaccine will come out. The sooner the vaccine comes out, the better for us. So I would rather be conservative with this and predict kind of the worst case scenario, and then have at least a nice surprise at the end and know that we did a better job with our numbers to work with. So that would be the approach that I would like to move forward with. I am glad that we do have multiple opportunities to look at this again, because we can always readjust.
Thank you, Vice Mayor O'Brien. So I think it sounds like unanimous concern that TOT is probably going to be a lot lower even than we anticipate. Staff, do you have sort of what you need from us as far as recommendations, as far as revenues adjusting downwards so that we take a little bit more conservative approach? Do you need any further discussion on that? Director Augustine or City Manager Goldman?
I'm sorry, I had my mic turned off. No, I think we have what we need. Each council is different. I was just having this discussion with our HDL person this afternoon, and he said, some want to be very, very conservative so that they feel more prepared for anything. Others don't want to have to make hard decisions about operating budgets, and so fail to look at the darkest possible side. And I said, well, we try and nail them. We try and get right on the money so that we, know to the extent possible what our resources look like, so that we don't underestimate them or overestimate them just for purposes of transparency and openness with our employees, with our residents, and with all interested parties. We really pride ourselves on keeping up with those revenues. Never before have they been so hard to keep up with, but we try to be as open and honest as we can about the possible outcomes. We are in a different situation. So with the council's desire to be a little bit more conservative with our revenues, we have the direction we need to go back and rework the numbers a little bit. Maybe, I'm not sure if we would need to have an additional meeting in June prior to bringing it back for adoption on June 15th, but that's something that we can discuss.
Okay. We appreciate that. And I think we do appreciate that the budget proposes, again, because we are so fortunate that we've entered this difficult time in very strong financial position, that, certainly our hope is that the budget projection can keep things, our staffing stable. It can keep our commitments to our pension 115 trust, and just have a very fiscally conservative approach as staff has proposed, with cutting back on our CIP and cutting back on areas where we can to keep our spending under control during this sort of unknown time. But if we can adjust particularly that TOT down a little bit to reflect what we are concerned may be the reality. And I see Councilmember Brownrigg has a final comment.
Final comment, Madam Mayor, because then we go on to the CIP. Is that it?
Well,
yeah, we can have discussion. I'm sorry. Director Augustine, did you have a
Sorry, yes, on that next step slide, in addition to direction on the budget, specifically, we ask that the community funding number is 55,000. It's the same as in the current year budget. And if you wanted to alter that, then you've already received the worksheets for that program. And so to do the calculations to be able to allocate the entire amount budgeted for the program, we ask that you let us know if you want that to be a different number than the current $55,000 that's in there. But that's other than that, yes, this item is done and we can move on to capital.
Okay, so let's have Councilmember Brownrigg have a comment, and then I think it would be valuable for us to at least address that one specific question that Director Augustine mentioned.
So I'm not going to handle that. I'll let others go first on that. But I did want to ask, I wanted to make a comment and a question on this part of the conversation tonight. So my comment is, we can call that a more conservative forecast. The fact is, I actually think it's more realistic. Anybody who thinks there isn't going to be a second wave and additional restrictions placed on economic behavior is, I would say, wildly optimistic. And you only have to listen to Dr. Fauci yesterday to kind of see that. So I actually think this is a more realistic forecast. My question is this, how do we position ourselves? Who is tracking the potential revenue that may come from the federal government to cities, and whether there are strings attached? And the reason I ask, and we don't have to address this tonight, but the reason I ask is there are clearly some strings that some in Congress want to put on that would say you can be reimbursed for this, but you can't be reimbursed for that. Or maybe it's just a flat check that goes out to cities and so forth. And I guess I just think we should try to be smart over the next few weeks about how we spend in case there are strings attached to those funds. Does that make sense?
I'll take a stab at that. There's specific things that FEMA will reimburse us for, and they're very limited. And so FEMA will reimburse us for, the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA, will reimburse us for things like cleaning supplies and PPE and things like that. So it's very limited, but we are tracking that. And Jan Cook, who is the finance director for the town of Hillsborough and serves as the finance director for CCFD, Central County Fire, it's kind of taken that on the fire side. And then we have our own tracking here. And so that's kind of the immediate stuff. The email that we all got from Brian Perkins today with Jackie Spears' office, that's just, if we were to get that 10 million in 1 year and 5 million in the next, which I think is highly unlikely, there are no strings on that money that we know of yet. But our lobbyists in DC who are working on the grade separation project for us are also sending us lots of information about what's going on in DC. And I'm getting information from a variety of other sources. So we are tracking all of that. But that is the House Democrats' proposal. And the Republicans have said that's dead on arrival in the Senate. So there's going to be some kind of a meeting of the minds, we hope, at some point, but that particular bill is not going to go through in that format, as we all realize from watching the past many years of fighting in DC.
So if I could just do a quick follow-up, then I completely get it, and I read it the same way, although I actually do think money will flow to cities because red and blue cities are all in trouble. But I think in our budget, while we can't make any predictions and shouldn't, we might have a line in there, Carol, that says, there is a potential positive variance to budget that could be federal aid, but at this point we can't predict.
What we usually do is we don't put things into the 5-year forecast until we know they're cooked. And so there's plenty of projects out there that we say, well, someday, hopefully Topgolf will open and we'll get revenue from Topgolf. But Carol can correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm pretty sure she's told us in the past, we don't put that in because we just want to make sure it's actually happening. So I think we all keep that in the back of our minds and we will say, wouldn't this be lovely if we get it? And if we come back to you in the fall, not wait till our normal March timeframe, but come back to you in the fall, we will have an answer presumably by then, because Congress usually recesses in September in a presidential year. And so now they may work a little bit longer, who knows? But, you know, we should know what's going on with the feds relatively quickly and then be able to, you know, absorb that money and put it somewhere safe for use. But I just don't think it's wise to put it in yet until we actually know what we're looking at.
Okay, thank you.
Good question. All right. Madam City Manager, while you've got the mic, is there anything else you need from us on this item?
I don't think so. We have our direction on, well, there's one thing. We have our direction on what you think about our forecasts, and you want a reduced revenue forecast, but we do need to know if you want us to increase the funding for the community groups. We have 55,000 in the budget, which matches what you have in the current fiscal year. We did give 20,000 to Samaritan House, 10,000 to Call Primrose, and then we gave additional funds just at your last meeting. 55,000 to Call Primrose, 100 to Samaritan House, and 20 to HIP. I believe all three of those agencies have submitted for community groups funding for kind of different purposes, for their general purposes. And if you wanted us to increase the community group funding from 55 to some other number, now's the time to let us know. And I do see Councilmember Ortiz raised his hand on that.
Thank you. Councilmember Ortiz, go ahead.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. Thank you, Madam City Manager. I think that we've done a big part in donations for some of these organizations, and I would be comfortable staying at where we are, or in some cases where we were funding the same organization again, I would even be considered going a little lower. But I'm you know, looking at this budget right now, I'm getting a little worried, and I think 55 would be more than adequate.
Thank you. Colleagues, does anybody have a concern that we should reduce it further, or anybody have a concern that we should increase it further? Seeing no other comments, I tend to agree. I don't think we have any business at this point increasing. If it's not a ton of money, but there are a lot of nonprofits that are struggling right now, and they probably others could seriously use this. But I'm comfortable with 55 unless anybody wants to recommend we reduce. Seeing no other comments, then I think that means we'll stay at 55.
Right.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you for that opportunity to discuss.
Carol, I think that was all you needed, right?
That's all I need. Thank you.
Okay. So I think that ends this part of the meeting, and then we have our CIP presentation from our Public Works Department, and I see Art just unmasked himself to give us our CIP presentation.
Okay, thank you. And I believe the slides were also in the packet as well, but thank you, Mr. Morimoto.
Good evening, Madam Mayor and members of the council. Can you guys hear me? Just
sure
to make
can.
sure. Okay. So this item is the proposed 2020-2021 capital improvement program. Next. Here's an overview of the presentation. And as you recall, the general fund, parking enterprise fund projects, and street resurfacing program were presented to council at the March 11th budget study session. And due to the, due to your current budget discussion, we are revisiting the CIP with reduced CIP alternatives for your consideration. And then we will go through the proposed water, sewer, and storm drainage CIP and seek council feedback, at which time we would like feedback on a reduced general fund CIP. So this is a recap of the general fund CIP from the March 11th meeting by various programs. This number also includes $1 million from Measure I, that's included in the sidewalk program. And so next, this is a summary of a reduced CIP proposal by program as well. And details of these reductions will come up shortly. And this reduced CIP, the Measure I funding was also reduced. So So this proposed CIP includes 800,000 from Measure I that's in the sidewalk program. Maybe back again, and then lastly, this further reduced to the minimal CIP, which addresses public health and safety issues, is shown in the third column there, and this number here also includes 800,000 from Measure I. So next, we will go through each program from what we saw on March 11th. So next slide there. And here's the Parks and Recreation project list from March 11th, with a total proposed at that time of 3.255 million. And next, the proposed reduced CIP alternative shown here eliminates the Cuernavaca field renovations and also eliminates the improvements at Bayside Park. And these projects will be added back in a future CIP when the economic times become better. The annual funding for the synthetic turf replacement fund and at the Burlingame School District and at Murray Field, these funds are recommended to continue, and they're just accumulated funds that are not actually spent and are used at a later date. The remaining maintenance programs in this reduced CIP alternative are all shown as being reduced or eliminated. And then, as you can see in the last column there, the minimal proposed CIP will defer most of the program work of the previous options. So that summarizes the Parks and Rec projects. Next to the building facility.
Aramoto, I'm sorry, just to,
Yeah.
I think one thing we really, for this conversation, it'll be important for us to understand really the substantive differences between reduced CIP and then just the public health and safety differences. So some are obvious, but like for the ones pathway and landscape improvements or athletic field renovations, could you explain give us a little bit more insight, what types of pathway and landscape improvements, what would we not have for athletic field renovations funds that we would be missing if we opted for public health and safety? The playground, equipment is pretty self-explanatory, but
Margaret is on and she can, I think, best speak to those.
thank you.
Good evening, Mayor Beach and council members. So the ones that they say fund, athletic field renovation, playground renovation fund, synthetic turf fund, those are to build a bank. So when we come to do a project, because we've been so far behind, we come and we say, we need $1.6 million for Cuernavaca. So the intent with those funds was to every year put some money away. So when we had a large project, what we were drawing on the general fund would have been less because we were building up a bank. It's
right.
Kind of getting ready for those that are coming up. We have every field that we have needs to be renovated. We haven't done any yet. Ray Park is the first one on the docket. It is funded, so that will be hopefully still happening this summer. And then Cuernavaca was next, and then we were going to be working our way through the other fields. So that's what the athletic field renovation fund would be. Something like pathway landscape improvements, park safety and maintenance. Those are for repairs to existing infrastructure that we have. So a lot of our pathways have challenges or areas need to be renovated. More recently, the library needed to be renovated to reduce water consumption and to make it more usable for the library staff and the patrons of the library. So projects like that come from somewhere. And so that is where that money goes. So we would, if we went to just public health and safety, we would be deferring some of the widening of the pathways or fixing them for ADA. The one we did keep in there for public safety is for park safety and maintenance. And those are for things that just happen. An example is we had some damage to one of the pathways in Washington Park and it needs to be repaired. Our operating budget isn't, our annual operating budget isn't flush with funds. So instead of always coming back to the council for projects like that, that's what that money is for. So we would use that to draw upon it. So most of those other ones are miscellaneous projects that come up. they're not always planned necessarily. Because the big ones that are planned, we would be coming to council as part of the CIP budget. Does that answer your question?
I think it does, and I think it's really important to remind the community what we're doing with the big line items. And item 3 and 4, the synthetic turf replacement and the Murray Field synthetic turf replacement fund. No brainer, that's consistent through all the budgets. I guess the two that I'm particularly interested in understanding, you elaborated on pathway and landscape, that's helpful, but what are we losing in item 6, which is athletic renovation fund? If we opt for the public health and safety version of the CIP versus reduced CIP, that would save us, 50.
So you're not losing anything. What that would go is it's a contribution to the next project, is what that is. We would use that plus other funds. So you're not losing.
Okay, got it. It's another piggy bank for.
It's a fund. Yeah.
But whereas in this budget consistently across, the two you're really recommending that we consistently put in our piggy bank are the synthetic turfs because they're so expensive. Okay, thank you for clarifying that.
Yeah, but the synthetic one, because it's expensive, and 2, especially for the Burlingame School District, it's a financial obligation based on our agreement with the school district.
Okay, you know what? I appreciate that clarification because on item 6 and 7, I was thinking it was a specific project, but it's another fund. So thank you for that. That's, I think, one of the most important things. If you can draw out in the presentation where we are going to be asked to consider which version of the CIP, how can you elaborate on the differences between, version 2 and 3? Thanks.
Okay.
Hold on a sec, Art. You have a hand up, Councilmember Brownrigg.
Thank you. Thank you, Madam Mayor. So I also appreciated that clarification. Basically, replacement fund could also be thought of as a sinking fund. And each one of those is, as you say, Mayor, a piggy bank. So that's helpful to me too. Did you want to have indications slide by slide, which seems to me might be simpler, or do you want to go through the entire presentation and then review this as one? I mean, I'd certainly be prepared to vote for the reduced CIP, but not the bare bones public health one at this point.
How do you, Madam City Manager, how do you recommend we approach this?
I think it's really up to you. If you want to go area by area so that you remember them all, that's fine. The difference at the end of the day, let me just flip through the staff report or the presentation. I think the difference at the end of the day was like 700,000, but I could be wrong about that. Yeah, it's a total of 13,405,000 versus 14,105,000. So it's not huge differences. It's all in, most of it's in, actually it's all in general fund projects, all the differences.
So the delta overall, you said is 7, I'm sorry, I didn't do that number very quickly, about 700.
14,105 versus 13,405. So is that what, like 700,000?
Yeah, about 700,000. Yeah. Okay. And that's funny. So, and I'm approaching. So I hear Councilmember Brown saying you're comfortable saying on this slide, go for the reduced CIP. My inclination, at least the way that I'm looking at all these slides, is I'm inclined to, at least at this point, go for the public health and safety, and then maybe add in one of the others if there's something super compelling I think we really shouldn't live without. I'm curious to see what colleagues.
Maybe the thing to do is to go through all of the general fund and then talk about the general fund.
Okay.
Because with different funding sources, you may want to make some trade-offs within these general fund projects that don't apply to the rest of it, but you kind of need to see the full picture of the street projects and whatnot.
Yeah, okay. I think that's reasonable. So will you make sure we pause after general fund in case I fail to?
I'm gonna try hard.
Okay, thank you. All right, so Mr. Muramoto, thanks for continuing.
Okay, so next we have the building facility projects. And we are recommending that all these projects can be deferred and that they should be deferred to future CIP. So in both scenarios, we're recommending no funding for these. The bike next, the bike ped and traffic improvements. Here's a summary of the list from March 11th. And next column has the proposed reduced CIP. Under sidewalk and ADA improvements, we're recommending that no general fund money be put to this project this year. And then the Measure I funding for the project will be 800,000. So that's the reduction from 1.4 to 800,000. Under Lion Hogue neighborhood traffic calming program, we're recommending the 950,000 was a recommendation to implement phase 1 of the proposed improvements. We're recommending in this reduced CIP to implement half of the improvements.
Can I just stop you for 1 sec, Art? This Lion Hogue traffic calming phase 1, you all don't know all about it yet because it's coming to you on Monday. So Monday you'll have the full picture of what this phase 1 means and what Art's talking about. But they're recommending in this middle columns going part of the way towards the phase 1 improvements.
Yeah, and so thanks, Lisa. And so yeah, on March 18th, you'll be presented with the entire study and findings. And at that time too, council can elect to reevaluate the funding at that time. And then the preliminary request funding that was requested for the bike ped master plan improvements was reduced. And the original 500,000 was, we were like almost pre-funding improvements to the bike ped master plan. Similarly, that plan will come back to council in the late summer. And so the 300,000 that we're proposing for a reduced CIP would be to implement or start implementing some of the improvements that kind of rise to the top even before council sees the plan in late summer. The Oak Grove, Carolyn traffic signal improvements. That project does have some funding, which we can continue on with the design and public review with the existing funding. And then the additional funding can be requested at the completion of the process prior to construction, if there are funds available. The City Hall traffic improvements, the roundabout concepts, we're just recommending that be deferred to a future date. And then the other funds, the implementation of the traffic signal improvements, the PED and traffic calming improvements, those are, I guess, similar to the funds that are in the park CIP, and they're there to provide staff with money to implement issues that arise during the year through studies or public requests. And then let's see, consultant assistance as well in this, in the reduced CIP has been either reduced or eliminated. And then going to the minimal CIP, we just further reduce Lion Hogue implementation and the bike ped pre-funding at this time. And the El Camino Real consultant assistance, that can be revisited as well as Caltrans moves the project forward. So were there any?
Pause for a moment. I want to see if colleagues have any questions on this slide. If not, I do have a question on the El Camino Real consultant assistance. Can you give us, can staff give us a little bit bigger picture of what that would be and why that might be important?
Well, as Caltrans moves forward with the renewal project, there could be some technical issues that arise that we feel we need some consultant assistance to assist in the review of the project. And those are really unknown at this time, but we're anticipating that some of these issues may come up. And again, we won't know until the process starts. And so this money was really set aside to provide funding available in the event that we needed that assistance.
Okay, thank you. Councilmember Brownrigg, you had a question?
Thank you. Can we go back to the building facility slide where we zeroed everything out? Here. Mostly I take your recommendations on this because this is a mostly technical, but I did wonder about fire stations 34 and 36, in part because we share, we are responsible for these fire stations, but they serve 3 cities. And I just want to make sure that whatever we're putting off, especially if it's roof repair, that we're not, that one concerned me, I guess.
So, I mean, this was intended to be like a comprehensive roof replacement plan where staff would go through and evaluate each roof, evaluate options, and plan, be able to plan out for future years the replacement of these roofs. In the event that a roof needs more kind of imminent repair, staff would be able to address that either through operating funds or some other minor facility funds.
So this was more by way of sort of a deep inspection of all of these different roofs, not actual roof work.
Yes, it was planning the improvements for the roof replacements for future years and kind of identifying materials that that would be desired and being able to just set up budgets for those going forward.
Okay, thank you.
Helpful clarification question. Thank you for asking it. I do see Councilmember Coulson has a question as well.
Yeah, so I just, again, sort of checking back in on the fire and the police station, but also really the firehouses. Just want to make sure everything that needs to get done at those firehouses is done because people are living in them. And it looks like you've got a good, some good money in here. You've got some budget putting in, but I just want to remind you that I think all my colleagues would agree that those need to be really habitable and they need to be safe and easy for our first responders to live in. So anything we can do there, I would support.
And Mr. Marmoto, have most of those renovations that really, I think that we're all top of mind that make them habitable, they're sort of either in progress or have just recently resolved, or do we still have kind of impending needs to make them habitable and livable at this point?
Significant improvements were made at Fire Station 35.
Hill, yeah.
And our staff is in constant discussions with the fire staff just to try to evaluate if other improvements can be made.
Okay.
So we are in constant conversations with the fire staff.
Okay, thank you for that. Colleagues, I see Vice Mayor O'Brien has a question.
Yes, Art, can you elaborate a little bit on the Lion Hogue, on what the difference would be versus the 500,000 and the 300,000, what is being taken out?
So let's see. Yeah, so
there's been a lot of issues with the Lion Hogue and we've been dealing with them for quite some time. So I just kind of want to know what the differences are.
So, so that's where we were trying to be sensitive not to reduce that budget to zero and keep funds in there. Really phase one, and you'll see a little more of this on May 18th, but phase one is really implementation of the, I guess the term low hanging fruit, the crosswalks, maybe speed bumps, some signage, temporary bulb outs, things like that have been identified through the study. So the 950,000 kind of covers the entirety of phase one. And all this does, it reduces the amount of phase one that can be implemented. It's just a reduction in the actual implementation of these improvements.
Right, but what would you be reducing? Is there any specific areas you would reduce or overall reduction?
The areas haven't been prioritized yet. I think a lot of that will come after the May 18th meeting, but it is just a reduced budget to reduce the implementation. That's kind of what's being represented here.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thank you for, I don't see any other questions, so we'll keep driving on at this point.
Okay, I saw Syed's face pop up. Did he want to comment or no?
No, Art, keep going. Thanks.
Okay. And then as requested by council at the March 11th budget session, this slide represents general fund 5-year CIP and magnitude of costs in the near future. The one note, the Measure I funds are not included in these numbers. And that also note that the higher numbers in 21-22 represent some of the deferred CIP from this year. And I mean, that scenario may not be likely, and this, this is updated every year. So this is the best guess of what we have on the horizon for the next 5 years. Also, just note that I think Carol mentioned this, that the large funding requirements, the Broadway Grade Cip and the El Camino Real undergrounding represent the full amount, and it's shown that way appropriated in 1 year. But in all likelihood, the actual cash flow, especially for the undergrounding, will extend over several years.
And Art, can I just add, one of the other jumps under the Park and Recreation is the obligation to the school district for the remaining amount for the pool improvements that were completed this past year.
Thank you.
Yes, and that's included in the 2022-2023 Parks and Rec 5-year CIP.
Thank you for that. I do see Councilmember Coulson had her hand up next, and then we'll go to Councilmember Ortiz.
Thank you. And Margaret, this one's for you. So the 10 million or so that we're going to need to finish off the community center, it comes closer to the end of the construction period. But obviously, is that already it's not in here because it's on the books already?
Actually, it doesn't come out of Parks and Recreation. It comes out of facilities. Carol would probably,
Oh, got it. So it doesn't come out of general fund capital improvements. It comes out of facilities. Okay, got it.
Oh, yeah.
Councilmember Ortiz.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just have a question about the funding of the grade separation. If we were able to get all the funding all together, would we be required to put it up front or to get going, or is that, because it looks like that's the assumption?
I mean, that's how it's shown here, but it depends on the nature of the grant and the match. Example, the match money that we have for the environmental study, the 500,000, that's the city match. We get billed that as the project progresses. So there's a chance this gets applied the same way, and that we are paying our proportionate share of the expenditures as the project moves along. Hopefully.
I'd like to clarify that the grant agency, when they fund the project, they would like the city to make a commitment, and that commitment year is expected to be 2023-2024 fiscal year. So city would have to sign some agreement that would guarantee the funding partners that City of Burlingame is committing to that to the amount.
And that's certainly a number that we've been, promoting in our grant applications as well. So we're essentially verbally committing, but yeah, the bottom line is we may have to deliver on it then. So thanks for those clarifications. Seeing no other hands up right now, Mr. Mormoto, do you have additional comments on this slide?
No, I don't. So that kind of wraps up the general fund. And then parking enterprise fund projects.
Let's pause at general fund. Madam City Manager, do you think this would be a good time to go back and talk a little bit about, because it sounds like the direction you need from us is whether or not the council prefers to figure into our budget a
Right.
reduced CIP scenario or the public health and safety
So I
scenario.
wonder if you can go back, Megan. It's several slides back. There's, keep going. That's the one that shows all the different general fund.
I think too, if you go forward past parking enterprise, a few
Oh, okay,
slides.
sorry, Megan.
So this, I mean, this separates these projects by funding source. So the general fund here, some of the previous numbers included the 800,000 for from Measure I, but this separates out Measure I funds. So this is the breakdown. I think in Carol's presentation, she used the reduced CIP scenario, and actually Measure I funds are considered general funds. So the CIP number she used was 3.155, I believe. So
That's correct.
Okay. You know, I'm wondering if it might be a little non-traditional. Madam City Manager, would it be appropriate since we're going to deliberate right now, if I opened it up to public comment just to see if any members of the public wish to speak on this, would that be okay? Or is it better to just do that at the end of the whole?
You are welcome to. I don't see any members of the public on the call, although there's one person I don't recognize. So maybe that one person is on for this purpose.
Okay, so at this
Like
point,
staff.
since we're going to be deliberating on, what direction to give, let's just give the public opportunity. Madam City Clerk, do we have any members of the public who would wish to speak on this general fund CIP before, because this is sort of section 1 of the CIP?
Nope.
Okay, then I will close public comment and let's have a conversation about what direction we want to give regarding CIP. Who would like to begin? I am not seeing any, unless I'm missing it, I'm not seeing any hands raised. I do see.
Councilmember Brownrigg's hand is raised.
I'll let you kick it off and then I'll head up next, unless somebody else wants to go. Go ahead, Councilmember Brownrigg.
I'll just be quick, Madam Mayor. I don't think $700,000. I support the reduced CIP. I'm sure we could pencil out bits and pieces, but in light of the reserves that we do have and the conversation that we've had, and frankly, in light of taking almost 8 million out of what we were planning to spend, I'm comfortable with the reduced CIP column.
Okay, and we'll go ahead and Councilmember Ortiz.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I have to agree with Councilmember Brownrigg. Again, I'm going to trust staff that they took the time to prioritize these and gave us what they feel is the right projects to work on. So instead of questioning line by line, I'm just going to agree with that. I think it makes sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember, Vice Mayor O'Brien.
I would have to agree. I'm good with the reduced CIP.
Okay, Councilmember Coulson.
Yes, I'm good going to the reduced CIP. And I just have a question. I know we're going to deal with this on the 18th on Lion Hogue. Is it possible to, some of these projects essentially, do they just kind of roll over to the next year, Art? Is that how it sort of works? So if we don't take care of it this year, it obviously has to get done. It just sort of rolls over until we can fund it.
I mean, it depends on the project, like the Parks and Rec project, the Cuerna Barca and Bayside Park. It's just rolled over to a future year. I mean, some of the other funds are really maintenance or issues that come up. So at some point they're going to have to be addressed. So it will just eventually come up and need to be funded. So if we defer it, it will come up.
Okay, thank you very much. I'm comfortable, with the reduced CIP column.
Okay, thanks, colleagues. Sounds like we have 4 in favor of reduced CIP. I tipped my hand earlier. I think I was leaning towards public health and safety at this point. At first, to try to save the 700,000 while we are in a state of unknown. I guess I would just ask if staff, as we have to rework numbers, as we've asked staff to reduce additional TOT revenues, if there's reason that we should rethink the CIP as a result of those reduction in revenue that we've requested, we can discuss that further at the June meeting. But if it sounds like we've got a direction that reduced CIP is the direction that the majority of council wants to go. So let's move on now to parking enterprise fund projects.
Yeah, so I think that, that was kind of part of that last number, but we're just proposing to defer the downtown parking lot resurfacing, and that will just be pushed out to future years, and there could be a reduction in the parking revenue as well. And then the street resurfacing program, although not general funded, we still are recommending reduction in this program from 2.56 to 1.6. And this also includes a reduction in Measure I funds based on the proposed Measure I revenue reduction from $1 million to $800,000. And so the next map shows the general area of where these the street resurfacing program will be next year. And so now on to the water, sewer, and storm. This.
Just let's pause a moment. Colleagues, do we have
Okay.
any questions on that? Seeing none. All right, we'll go ahead and continue. Thanks. I just want to make sure nobody had a question.
Okay, so the water, onto the water CIP. Next, yeah, I think you'll find these pretty straightforward, and I'm not going to get into a lot of detail on each. The water site CIP proposed at 3.5 million, and the first three projects on the list are funding for pipeline replacement projects, which we are doing annually citywide. And one note, the South El Camino Real project will complete the remaining water improvements required on El Camino Real, and that'll be that is in anticipation of the renewal project that's underway. Up at Hillside and Skyview reservoirs, there's miscellaneous site improvements that are proposed. Includes vehicular access improvements at Hillside Reservoir site. And then the water planning with studies and modeling. Those funds are earmarked for updating the urban water management plan, which is due to be updated next year. And then also there's some additional federal requirements for studies of our water system from the American Water Infrastructure Act that are required, and that's what these funds will fund that as well. And then to round it out, the operational improvements, some operational improvements at Truesdale Pump Station, and then the annual water meter replacement project will round out the rest of the CIP for a total of 3.5 mil. And then on to the sewer.
Mr. Morimoto, I'm sorry, we do have a hand up from Councilmember Brownrigg.
Okay.
Thanks. I should remember, but I don't. Is this the part of the CIP that is also responsible for storm drains and that system?
No, it is not. It's just the water, potable water system.
This is the drinking water
Drinking
system.
water, yeah.
Thank you.
Yes. So on to the sewer enterprise fund projects. Oh, here's a map. This is a map of the project areas for the water improvements. As you can see, most of the pipeline improvements are in the south part of Burlingame there. Then on to the sewer system improvements. As I think as Carol mentioned, sewer enterprise is anticipating reduced revenue projections due to the impacts of this whole coronavirus thing. It's the impacts to the hotels and restaurants impact the sewer enterprise funds much more than it impacts the water fund. And the CIP has been reduced this year accordingly. And so you can see a rather lower CIP than you're used to seeing. And so the wastewater treatment plant upgrades, the 800,000 there is to address various repair and upgrades of the aging infrastructure there, projects that were identified in the master plan of the treatment plant that was done a few years back. And then the El Camino Real sewer rehab is to provide funding for design of improvements on El Camino to try to get those improvements completed prior to the renewal project as well. And then additional funding for the Rawlins Road Pump Station Force Main project. Additional force main was identified to be replaced, so additional funds are being requested for that project for a total of 1.8 million. And then if there's no questions there, here's locations.
I do have a question, Mr. Moroto, on the El Camino Real sewer rehab. So that sounds like it's some study work and design work that would happen, knowing that the road is going to get torn up more than likely in the next couple of years. Would that sewer rehabilitation happen from a phasing point of view before any other construction to kind of get that done, or would it happen in conjunction with any other construction that might happen by Caltrans?
So it's intended to be completed before any work is done by Caltrans, so we can get our work out of the way before they start.
So that's additional disruption for the community. Is there any way, this is probably not the conversation to have it, but I guess that it sounds like that's the way it has to be done from a phasing point of view. It can't be, if the road is getting ripped up, it sounds like, from lay people would rather get it done at once. But are there obstacles with that?
In all likelihood, it's this type of work, even though it were done with like a larger project, it would be conducted by a separate subcontractor, and the work would be performed separately anyway. And so the disruption there wouldn't be, hit one area and everyone goes in and does these improvements. Ideally, this work is done prior to other work.
Okay, all right. Thank you for it. That's at least a good heads up play that we're trying to address those needs that are inevitable at whatever the right time our staff thinks they should happen. So, thank you.
And then on to the storm drain projects, and these are the ones Councilmember Brownrigg you're asking about. And here's a list of the proposed CIP for this coming fiscal year, total of 4.5 million. It's the neighborhood storm drain number 13. It's a continuation of the storm drain improvements that were identified in the citywide evaluation that was previously done in 2010, and also other locations that are identified by operations staff or through public requests that warrant improvements. Through the first 12 projects, we've completed 163 locations citywide. And so we've been, the funds have been spread throughout the city. And this is a continuation of those improvements. Large diameter storm drain cleaning, it's providing funding to, it's pretty self-explanatory to clean the large diameter storm drains. Many of those have accumulated sediment, and it's to evaluate and remove that sediment to restore capacity, similar to the improvement that was done on Lorton a few years back with the storm drain there. The next project, Burlingame Avenue storm drainage improvements. This is down on the 100 to 600 block of Burlingame Avenue, and it's to construct a new storm drain. Right now, everything is surface drain the Rollins, and so there's localized flooding areas, and this system will help alleviate some of that. And then lastly, culvert crossing repairs. This is a continuation of improvements that were identified in a citywide study that was conducted in just a few years ago in 2018. And so that rounds out the total of 4.5 million for the storm drainage improvements.
Thank you for that. I see Councilmember Brownrigg has his hand up with a question.
Well, thanks. And I know we're getting late, but I mean, one of the things that stuck with me in '09, and I think Vice Mayor O'Brien would say the same, is the city at that point didn't have the reserves we have today, and it did have to start really starving some of our infrastructure investment, which then led to much more costly catch up. And especially when it comes to the storm drains and the recent winters we've had that have led to rather large claims against the city, I just want to make sure that we are investing here in a way that, is likely to diminish impacts on residents and impact, diminish, frankly, liability for us. So I just don't, I think this looks fully funded. I just want to put in a pitch for making sure we keep investing in our storm drain system, given climate change and the rest of it. Thank you.
Thank you for that comment. I couldn't agree more. This kind of infrastructure can't be skimped on as long as we can possibly fund it. So any other comments or questions on these slides?
And then last is just a summary of last slide here is just a summary of the totals and with the three general fund options, the totals at the bottom. And so at this point, I think you've given the feedback, but if there's any more feedback or questions, now's the time.
Thank you, Mr. Morimoto, for the presentation. So we did cover general fund projects. We went through a lot more quickly. The parking enterprise, street resurfacing, water enterprise, sewer system, and storm drain projects, all of which are pretty self-explanatory with reduced CIP. Colleagues, do we have any other, actually, let me open it up to public comment at this point to see if any members of the public wish to speak on this second half of the draft CIP. Madam City Clerk, do we have any members of the public who wish to speak?
No.
Okay. I'll check the phone lines, anything. I don't see any hands raised, so we'll close public comment and see if colleagues have any other final questions on the second half of the CIP presentation. Seeing no questions or comments, I think that means we're pretty comfortable.
I have one question.
Yes, Councilmember.
So, Art, when's the last time you got your hair cut? I'm just teasing you.
Okay. I was going to answer.
You look like you've been sheltering in place.
Yes, yes.
Do we have any other comments on the second half of the CIP? I think there were not, I'm looking here on the, there's really no difference on the reduced CIP is what's recommended. There's really no public health and safety options unless I'm dreaming that up. So I think there's, unless any, doesn't seem like colleagues have any other questions, right, Mr. Morimoto? There's no version A or version B we're considering tonight.
No, I think the feedback on the first part is
right.
The feedback we were looking
right.
for.
I think the first half had a little bit more flexibility. It seemed the second half that we had are really essential infrastructure, less optional types of infrastructure. So with that, Madam City Manager, do you have anything else you need from us?
I do not.
Okay, so this was, it's always a huge lift, and our staff worked so hard to prepare these budget presentations for us, but add additional complexity with COVID-19, all the unknowns, and trying to keep our essential city services functioning and investments in our infrastructure. We really appreciate all the hard work that staff went into preparing this. And again, these last two items were sort of study items for future finalizing, such as it can be under these conditions when we meet again in June. With that, unless I don't think there is any, let me get my agenda out, which is now buried in my pile. We adopted the initial resolution earlier. We've had 2 study sessions. So I think at this point, without any other further kind of comments or closure, I guess we can go ahead and adjourn. Colleagues, any last comments? Seeing none. Okay, I want to thank members of the public for joining us and colleagues and staff for all their hard work. We'll adjourn the budget session at 9 p.m. tonight. Thanks so much for your participation. Have a good evening.
Thank you all. Good night.
Good night. Thank you.